The recipe we were never meant to find. The rain had started just before dawn. By the time the funeral ended, the narrow streets of Ashford Cove glistened beneath a cold gray sky, reflecting the amber glow of old street lamps that had already flickered on despite the early afternoon hour. Wet maple leaves clung to the sidewalks and gathered in little swirling corners beside the curbs, pushed gently by the salty wind drifting in from the harbor. Margaret Whitmore stood quietly beneath a black umbrella near the cemetery gate, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around the wooden handle as the last of the mourners slowly disappeared down the hill. The church bells had stopped ringing nearly 10 minutes ago. Now there was only rain, soft, steady, endless. She watched Clara Bennett climb carefully into her old blue sedan, waving one last time through the fogged window before driving away toward Main Street. A few others lingered politely near their cars, speaking in hushed voices that dissolved into the cold air. Everyone always spoke softly after funerals in small towns like Ashford Cove, as if grief itself could hear them. Maggie adjusted the wool scarf around her neck and looked once more toward the fresh mound of dark earth beneath the fading flowers. Her mother was gone, even after the hospital room, even after the paperwork, even after choosing the dress for the burial. The truth still sat strangely inside her chest, heavy and unreal. Helen Whitmore had lived in Ashford Cove for 86 years. She had taught Sunday school at the little white church near Harbor Road. She had baked blackberry pies every Thanksgiving. She had known every child born in town for nearly 4 decades, and now the world somehow continued without her. The thought felt impossible. A sharp gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling the nearly bare trees overhead. Maggie pulled her coat tighter and finally turned toward the parking lot. Her old station wagon waited beneath the dripping branches of an elm tree. As she drove through town, familiar places passed slowly through the rain-streaked windows. The harbor, the bookstore with the crooked green awning, the diner where her father used to drink coffee every Saturday morning, the lighthouse standing quietly in the distance like an aging guardian watching over the coast. Everything looked smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps she had simply grown older. The tires hissed softly over wet pavement as she turned onto Willow Lane. Her childhood home appeared at the end of the street exactly as it always had. Tall, silent, waiting. The old Victorian house stood beneath towering maple trees whose orange leaves carpeted the yard in damp layers. The wraparound porch sagged slightly more than it had last autumn, and the white paint along the railing had begun to peel from years of ocean wind. But the warm porch light still glowed beside the front door. Her mother had always left it on. Just in case someone needs to find their way home, she used to say. Maggie swallowed hard. The house looked lonely now. She parked slowly and sat for a moment listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy bell echoed through the harbor fog. For a brief second, she almost expected to see her mother pull open the front curtains and wave from the window. But the house remained still, dark, quiet. Maggie finally stepped out into the cold afternoon air and climbed the porch steps carefully. The wood creaked beneath her shoes, familiar as an old song. When she unlocked the front door, The scent met her instantly. Cinnamon, tea leaves, old books, wood polish, and something else. Something impossible to describe except as memory itself. The warmth inside wrapped around her gently. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily in the hallway. Tick, 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 as though time had refused to stop. Maggie removed her coat slowly and hung it beside her mother's faded brown raincoat, still resting on the hook nearby. She couldn't bring herself to move it. The living room sat frozen in quiet stillness. Crocheted blankets rested neatly over the sofa. Family photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace. Her father's old jazz record still occupied the cabinet beside the piano Eleanor Whitmore had once played decades ago. Nothing had changed, and somehow everything had. Maggie wandered into the kitchen. A pale gray light filtered through the rain-speckled windows, casting soft shadows across the yellow floral wallpaper. Copper pots hung above the stove. The old kettle still sat near the sink. Her mother's reading glasses remained folded neatly beside a cookbook on the table. Maggie touched them gently with trembling fingers. The silence in the house felt enormous. Not empty, but waiting. As evening settled over Ashford Cove, the rain grew heavier. Maggie made herself a cup of Earl Grey tea and sat beside the kitchen window, wrapped in one of her mother's knitted blankets. Outside, the wind stirred the wet leaves across the yard, while fog slowly swallowed the distant harbor lights. The house groaned softly now and then with the sounds old houses make after dark. Wood settling, pipes humming, floorboards shifting. Familiar sounds, comforting sounds. Still, something felt different tonight. Maggie stared into the darkness beyond the window, listening absent-mindedly to the ticking clock in the hallway. Then she heard it, a noise above her, soft, slow, a creak, directly overhead, from the attic. Maggie froze. The teacup trembled slightly in her hands. Another sound followed, not loud, just the faint scrape of something moving across wood. Her heartbeat quickened. The attic had been locked for years. Very slowly, Maggie lifted her eyes toward the ceiling as the old house settled once more into silence. But this time, the silence no longer felt empty. The storm lasted through the night. By morning, Ashford Cove had disappeared beneath a blanket of silver fog drifting inland from the harbor. Rainwater clung to the windows in trembling droplets, while the maple trees outside swayed gently beneath the cold ocean wind. Maggie barely slept. Every creak of the house had kept her awake. Every sigh of old wood settling in the darkness. And every time she closed her eyes, she thought again of the sound from above her ceiling. The attic. At 7:30, she stood alone in the kitchen wearing a thick cream-colored sweater, both hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The smell of fresh grounds mixed with the familiar scent of cinnamon lingering permanently in the old house. Outside, gulls cried faintly over the distant harbor. Inside, the grandfather clock continued its patient ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Maggie glanced toward the ceiling again. The attic entrance sat at the end of the upstairs hallway behind a narrow white door her mother rarely opened. As a child, Maggie had always imagined treasures hidden up there, or ghosts. In old houses, the two sometimes felt the same. She carried her coffee upstairs slowly, one hand gliding along the polished wooden banister worn smooth by generations of Whitmore hands. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Family photographs lined the walls in dark wooden frames. Graduations, Christmas mornings, summer picnics by the harbor, Thanksgiving dinners around crowded tables. An entire lifetime preserved in fading colors. At the very end of the hall, the attic door waited quietly beneath a small stained glass window. Maggie hesitated. The brass handle felt cold in her palm. For a moment, she almost turned back downstairs. But something deeper than curiosity held her there. A feeling, a pull, as if the house itself wanted her to keep going. The door creaked softly when she opened it. A narrow staircase disappeared upward into shadows. Cool air drifted down, carrying the unmistakable scent of old wood, paper, dust, and forgotten years. Maggie reached for the pull chain beside the entrance. The single attic bulb flickered weakly overhead. Once, twice, then glowed with a dim amber light. Slowly she climbed. The stairs groaned beneath every step. At the top, the attic opened around her like a hidden world untouched by time. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of gray morning light spilling from a small circular window near the roof. Old furniture stood beneath white sheets like sleeping figures. Stacked boxes lined the walls beside trunks, broken lamps, and decades of forgotten belongings. The air smelled dry and ancient, like paper memories. Maggie moved carefully between boxes labeled in her mother's handwriting. Christmas decorations, Robert's Navy things, kitchen linen. Each box felt strangely sacred, a preserved fragment of another life. Rain tapped softly against the roof overhead. Then Maggie noticed it. Near the far corner beneath the window sat a small cedar chest she didn't recognize. Unlike everything else in the attic, it had no dust on top, as if someone had touched it recently. Her pulse quickened slightly. She knelt carefully beside it. The wood was dark and smooth, with delicate carvings along the edges, roses intertwined with vines. Her grandmother Eleanor loved roses. Maggie brushed her fingertips across the lid, then slowly opened it. The scent hit her instantly. Cinnamon, vanilla, nutmeg, warmth. Even after all these years, the box still carried the faint, comforting aroma of old baking spices. Inside lay dozens of recipe cards tied together with faded blue ribbon. Some were stained with butter, others with flour. Several edges had yellowed deeply with age. Maggie smiled softly despite herself. Her grandmother's recipes. Carefully she lifted the stack. Beneath the cards rested several old envelopes tied with twine, and underneath those, a photograph. Her breath caught. The picture showed Eleanor Whitmore standing outside Rose Harbor Bakery sometime in the late 1940s. She looked young and radiant, wearing a pale dress beneath a wool coat. Her dark hair curled softly against the wind. But it wasn't Eleanor that startled Maggie. It was the man standing beside her. Tall, handsome, one arm resting gently behind Eleanor's back. Maggie stared at the face. She had never seen him before. Not once. And in a town like Ashford Cove, That meant something. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, were 4 words. For the days we lost. Maggie swallowed hard. A strange unease crept slowly through her chest. Beneath the photograph lay a folded recipe card unlike the others. The paper looked older, more fragile. At the top, written carefully in elegant cursive, Eleanor's autumn apple pie. Maggie unfolded it gently. The handwriting flowed beautifully across the page. Cinnamon, brown sugar, nutmeg, cold butter, fresh orchard apples. But scattered between the recipe lines were tiny handwritten notes squeezed into the margins. Not baking instructions, messages, tiny fragments. Wait until the first frost. The lighthouse knows. Don't trust November promises. Maggie frowned. At the very bottom of the page, barely visible beneath a water stain, appeared a final sentence written in darker ink. Some secrets are meant to wait. A chill moved through the attic despite the sweater wrapped around her shoulders. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the ocean. Then suddenly, a loud thud echoed somewhere deeper in the attic. Maggie jerked upright. The old bulb overhead flickered violently. Once, twice, and from the darkest corner near the back wall, something metallic glimmered briefly beneath a torn white sheet. By late afternoon, the rain had softened into a cold mist that drifted quietly through Ashford Cove like smoke from an old dream. The attic box sat on Maggie's kitchen table. She had carried it downstairs carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid the fragile memories inside might disappear if handled too roughly. Now the cedar chest rested beneath the warm yellow glow of the hanging kitchen lamp, while shadows gathered softly in the corners of the old room. Outside, bare branches scratched gently against the windows. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee, old paper, and cinnamon from the recipe card lying unfolded beside her teacup. Maggie adjusted her reading glasses and studied the delicate handwriting again. Eleanor's autumn apple pie. The words alone stirred something deep inside her chest. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice. As a child, Maggie used to sit on the counter while Eleanor baked in this very kitchen. She remembered the warmth of the oven against her legs, the flour dust floating through beams of sunlight, the soft hum of old jazz records spinning nearby. Most of all, she remembered the smell. Apples, brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, the scent of safety, the scent of home. A quiet ache settled over her as she reached for the faded recipe card once more. The handwriting remained elegant despite the years. Eleanor had always written beautifully, every letter curved with patient precision. But the strange notes in the margins unsettled Maggie now more than they had upstairs. Wait until the first frost. The lighthouse knows. Don't trust November promises. What did that even mean? She traced her fingers lightly over the faded ink. Then her eyes drifted toward the ingredients. For reasons she couldn't explain, Maggie suddenly felt an overwhelming need to make the pie. Not tomorrow, not later, now. Almost as if the recipe itself was calling to her. The old kitchen seemed to awaken around her as she stood. Cabinet doors opened with familiar creaks. Mixing bowls clinked softly against the counter. The old farmhouse sink groaned when she turned the faucet handle. Rain whispered steadily against the windows. The ritual came back naturally, like muscle memory carried through generations. Maggie sifted flour into her grandmother's large ceramic bowl, watching the pale powder drift downward like fresh snow. She added salt, then cut cold butter into the mixture slowly with worn silver pastry knives that had belonged to Eleanor decades ago. The buttery scent rose immediately. Warm, comforting, familiar. For the first time since the funeral, Maggie felt her breathing steady. Baking had always been the language of Whitmore women. Not just food, love, apologies, memories, healing. As she peeled the apples, the kitchen filled with their sweet, crisp fragrance. Outside, evening deepened over Ashford Cove, turning the windows black except for faint reflections of the warm kitchen light. Somewhere beyond the fog, the harbor bell echoed softly. Maggie paused. That sound had always frightened her slightly as a child. Her grandmother once told her, "The ocean remembers things people try to forget." At the time, Maggie thought it was just another strange old saying. Now she wasn't so sure. She sprinkled cinnamon over the sliced apples and suddenly froze. There, near the bottom edge of the recipe card, another marking. One she hadn't noticed before. Tiny initials. J.M. Maggie frowned. The letters were nearly hidden beneath an old water stain. Not Eleanor's handwriting. Different, sharper, more hurried. Her pulse quickened slightly. Who was J.M.? The unknown man from the photograph? Another family member, a friend? The kitchen suddenly felt quieter. Too quiet. Even the clock ticking in the hallway seemed distant now. Maggie stared at the initials while old memories stirred faintly at the edges of her mind. Had she heard those letters before? No. Or maybe, when she was very young. Thunder rumbled faintly over the ocean. The lights flickered once overhead. Maggie exhaled slowly and returned to the pie, pressing the dough carefully into Eleanor's old pie dish. The movement soothed her. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the windows while darkness swallowed the yard beyond the porch light. The house creaked gently around her, alive with memory. When the pie finally entered the oven, warmth spread through the kitchen almost immediately. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples wrapped around the room with such heartbreaking familiarity that Maggie suddenly had to steady herself against the counter. Tears blurred her vision. For one impossible second, she could almost see them all here again. Her father laughing near the table, her mother pouring tea, Eleanor humming softly near the stove. The old Thanksgiving dinners, the crowded kitchen, the warmth, the noise, the family. Gone now, or almost gone. Maggie wiped her eyes quietly. Then, a sharp knock startled her. 3 slow knocks against the front door. She frowned and glanced toward the hallway clock. 7:42 p.m. Who would visit in weather like this? The knocks came again. Slow. Heavy. Maggie crossed the hallway carefully, the old floorboards creaking beneath her steps. Cold air drifted faintly through the edges of the front door. When she opened it, the wind immediately swept rain across the porch. And standing there beneath the porch light was Daniel. Her son looked exhausted. His dark coat glistened with rainwater, and shadows rested heavily beneath his eyes. One hand gripped the strap of a worn leather duffel bag, while the other remained shoved deep into his pocket against the cold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel glanced past her shoulder toward the warm kitchen light, and the smell of apple pie drifting through the house. His expression changed instantly, not dramatically, just enough. A flicker of memory, of childhood, of home. "Mom," he said quietly. Maggie's throat tightened. "You came." Daniel nodded once. Outside, thunder rolled low over the dark Atlantic as somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. The storm worsened overnight. Wind rattled the old windows while rain swept across Ashford Cove in silver waves, blurring the harbor lights into soft golden smears against the darkness. By morning, the entire town seemed wrapped in fog and memory. Maggie stood in the kitchen pouring coffee when Daniel finally came downstairs. For a moment, she simply watched him quietly. 38 years old. And yet something about sleepy mornings still made him look like the boy who used to race barefoot through these hallways on Christmas mornings. His hair was slightly damp from the shower, curling faintly at the edges the way his father's once had. He wore an old gray sweater Maggie recognized immediately. She had knitted it for him nearly 12 years ago. The realization warmed her unexpectedly. "You still have that?" she asked softly. Daniel glanced down at the sweater as though he hadn't noticed. "Oh," he said with a tired shrug. "Yeah, it's warm." Maggie smiled faintly and handed him a mug. Outside, the wind bent the maple branches low against the rain. Daniel sat carefully at the kitchen table while silence settled between them. Not hostile silence, but the awkward kind shared by people who loved each other deeply and no longer knew how to say it aloud. The pie from last night rested beneath a glass dome on the counter. Its cinnamon scent still filled the room. Daniel noticed it immediately. "You made Grandma Eleanor's pie?" Maggie nodded. "I found the recipe yesterday." Something in her tone made him look up. "Found it where?" "The attic." Daniel leaned back slightly. "That place still gives me nightmares." A small laugh escaped Maggie before fading again. "You used to think ghosts lived up there." I was probably right. The old clock ticked softly nearby. Rain whispered against the windows. Maggie studied her son carefully over the rim of her coffee cup. He looked thinner than usual, more tired. Divorce had hollowed something out inside him. Even now, months later, she could still see the loneliness clinging quietly to him like winter air. "How's Boston?" she asked gently. Daniel gave the answer people give when they don't want to discuss their lives. "Busy." Maggie nodded slowly. "And work?" "Fine." Another silence. The distance between them felt larger than the kitchen itself. Once, Daniel told her everything. When he was 10, he used to sit at this very table describing entire school days in exhausting detail while eating peanut butter cookies fresh from the oven. Now, conversations felt like walking carefully across thin ice. Maggie finally reached for the recipe card lying beside her. There was something strange in the box. Daniel looked mildly curious but cautious. "Strange how?" She handed him the old photograph. He studied it quietly. The unknown man beside Eleanor, the faded smile, the handwritten words on the back. For the days we lost. Daniel frowned. I've never seen this before. Neither have I. He flipped the photograph over once more. Maybe just an old friend. Maggie shook her head slowly. No. If someone stood beside Eleanor like this in Ashford Cove. She paused. People would have known. Daniel set the picture down carefully. You really think there's some big family mystery hidden in a pie recipe? His tone carried faint amusement, but Maggie noticed something else underneath it. Interest, curiosity, even if he refused to admit it yet. She slid the recipe card toward him. What about these? Daniel adjusted the paper closer. His eyes moved slowly over the handwritten notes. The lighthouse knows. He gave a quiet breath through his nose. Okay, that's unsettling. Maggie folded her arms. And the initials? J.M. Daniel stared thoughtfully at the card. The kitchen seemed unusually still around them. Only the sound of rain filled the silence. Finally, he looked up. You think Grandma hid messages inside a pie recipe? I think Eleanor wanted someone to find this eventually. Why now? Maggie glanced toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the old house. I don't know. But even as she said it, she felt the strange pull again. The feeling that something long buried had quietly awakened. Daniel stood and wandered toward the window. Outside, fog rolled slowly across the street while dead leaves skittered along the pavement beneath the wind. This town hasn't changed at all, he murmured. Maggie smiled sadly. It has. He turned toward her. You know what I mean. Yes, she did. Boston had changed him. The city moved too fast. Everything there felt temporary. People, relationships, promises. Ashford Cove remembered everything. That was both its comfort and its burden. Daniel's gaze drifted toward the staircase, then upward, toward the attic. You said you found the box yesterday? Maggie nodded. And there was another noise last night. His brow tightened slightly. What kind of noise? Like something moving. Daniel looked skeptical again, but less certain now. Old houses make noises. Yes, Maggie said quietly. But this felt different. A long silence followed. Then Daniel surprised her. Show me the attic. Maggie blinked. You want to see it? I'm here all week anyway. He grabbed his coffee mug and attempted a faint smile. Besides, he glanced once more at the photograph. Now I kind of want to know who that man was. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the distant ocean, and somewhere far above them in the attic came the soft sound of something falling. By the following afternoon, the storm had finally begun to loosen its grip on Ashford Cove. The rain still lingered in soft silver drizzles now and then, but patches of pale autumn sunlight occasionally broke through the heavy clouds, casting brief golden reflections across puddles lining Main Street. The harbor remained hidden beneath rolling fog, and the cold ocean wind carried the distant cries of gulls through town like forgotten echoes. Maggie and Daniel walked slowly beneath a shared umbrella toward Harper's Cafe, their shoes brushing through damp leaves gathered along the sidewalks. The town looked exactly as Maggie remembered from childhood during late November. Small, quiet, familiar. The antique shop windows glowed warmly despite the gray afternoon. Wreaths decorated old storefronts in preparation for Thanksgiving. A delivery truck rattled past the post office, while somewhere farther down the street, church bells rang softly through the fog. Daniel shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets. "I forgot how quiet this place gets after summer," he said. Maggie smiled faintly. "That's why people stay." Daniel glanced toward the harbor. "Or why people leave." The words lingered between them for a moment. Not cruel, just honest. Maggie knew Ashford Cove could feel suffocating to younger people. Dreams often seem too large for small coastal towns. Daniel had spent years building a life in Boston precisely because he feared becoming trapped here. Yet lately, Boston hadn't looked good on him. The city had sharpened something inside him, worn him down quietly. As they approached Harper's Cafe, the comforting scent of roasted coffee beans drifted through the cold air. The cafe sat on the corner of Harbor Street, tucked inside a weathered brick building with fogged windows and a faded green awning. Maggie had been coming here for nearly 40 years. The bell above the door jingled softly when they entered. Warmth wrapped around them instantly. The cafe smelled like coffee, cinnamon pastries, old wood, and rain-damp coats drying near the entrance. Soft jazz played quietly through hidden speakers while conversations hummed gently beneath the clinking of mugs and silverware. Several townspeople looked up immediately. Small-town eyes always noticed newcomers, especially familiar ones returning home. "Maggie Whitmore," called a cheerful voice from the back corner. "Well, there she is." Clara Bennett rose from her booth near the window, waving enthusiastically. At 67, Clara still moved with surprising energy. Her silver curls framed a face permanently touched by amusement, and her bright blue scarf nearly matched the color of her sharp, curious eyes. She kissed Maggie warmly on the cheek before turning toward Daniel. "Well," Clara said dramatically, "look who finally remembered this town exists." Daniel laughed softly despite himself. "Good to see you too, Clara." "Oh, don't flatter yourself," she teased. "I'm only being nice because your mother raised you properly." For the first time since arriving home, Maggie noticed Daniel genuinely smile. Not polite, not forced, real. And it made her chest ache unexpectedly. They settled into the booth beside the fogged window while Clara immediately launched into local updates the way only lifelong small-town residents could. Mrs. Porter's grandson had gotten engaged. The Harbor Bakery downtown might finally reopen. Someone's fishing boat broke loose during the storm. The church roof still leaked every winter despite 20 years of repairs. The familiar rhythm soothed Maggie more than she expected. For a little while, life almost felt normal again. Then Clara noticed the photograph. Maggie had slipped it into her purse earlier that morning, unable to leave it behind. "What's that?" Clara asked casually. Maggie hesitated, then slowly handed her the picture. The moment Clara saw the unknown man beside Eleanor, her expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. Maggie noticed instantly. "You recognize him?" Clara looked up too quickly. "No," she said, almost automatically. "Well, maybe." Daniel leaned forward. "You know who he is?" Clara glanced nervously toward the cafe windows as though checking whether someone might overhear. Rain trickled slowly down the glass behind her, Finally, she lowered her voice. I haven't seen that photograph in 50 years. Maggie felt her heartbeat quicken. You have seen it. Clara sighed heavily and carefully set the picture on the table. Your grandmother used to keep it hidden in the bakery office, she admitted quietly. Back before the fire. Daniel frowned. What fire? Both women looked at him. Maggie blinked in surprise. You never heard about the bakery fire? Daniel shook his head slowly. No. Clara gave a soft whistle. Well, I suppose people stopped talking about it eventually. The cafe suddenly felt quieter around them. Outside, fog drifted heavily across Main Street, while headlights moved dimly through the gray afternoon. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Rose Harbor Bakery used to be the busiest place in town, she began softly. Back in the 40s and early 50s, people lined up every morning before sunrise. Your grandmother baked everything herself. Maggie smiled faintly. She remembered the bakery only vaguely from childhood before it closed permanently. Mostly scents, warm bread, vanilla frosting, sugar. And the man? Maggie asked carefully. Clara hesitated again. I don't remember his full name. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly. You don't remember, or you don't want to say? Clara gave him an irritated look. You always were too smart for your own good. Daniel almost smiled. Clara lowered her voice further. His initials were J.M. Maggie's stomach tightened instantly. The recipe card. J.M. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with his mother. Who was he? Maggie whispered. Clara stared into her coffee for several long seconds, then finally said, Someone Eleanor loved. Silence settled heavily over the booth. Even the jazz music seemed distant now. Maggie struggled to imagine it. Her grandmother had always seemed larger than romance somehow. Strong, steady, untouchable. Not secretive, not heartbroken. Clara continued quietly. He arrived in Ashford Cove sometime after the war. Quiet man. Worked near the harbor for a while. She paused. People said Eleanor changed after meeting him. How? Maggie asked softly. Clara's expression grew sad. She started looking toward the ocean all the time. Rain tapped softly against the cafe windows. Daniel leaned back slowly. So what happened? Clara looked toward the harbor again. That, she whispered, depends on who you ask. A cold silence settled over the table. Then Clara reached carefully into her purse. I wasn't sure whether to give this to you, she said quietly. From inside an old leather wallet, she removed a yellowed envelope tied with faded blue ribbon. Maggie stared at it. The handwriting across the front made her breath catch instantly. Eleanor's. I found these years ago after the bakery closed, Clara admitted softly. Your mother told me never to mention them. Daniel frowned. Letters? Clara nodded. From 1948. Outside the cafe window, thunder rolled faintly over the distant ocean, and for the first time since discovering the recipe box, Maggie felt genuinely afraid of what they might uncover. That evening, the fog thickened so heavily over Ashford Cove that the harbor lights disappeared completely. The ocean itself seemed to vanish. Only the sound remained. distant waves crashing softly somewhere beyond the darkness. Cold wind rattled the old maple branches outside Maggie's house, while inside, the kitchen glowed with gentle amber light from the hanging lamp above the table. The letters sat between Maggie and Daniel, untouched. Neither of them had spoken much during the drive home from Harper's Cafe. The envelope alone carried a strange, emotional weight, as though opening it might disturb something that had remained buried for decades. Maggie brewed fresh tea while Daniel stood near the kitchen window, staring into the fog-covered street outside. The house smelled of bergamot, cinnamon, and rain-soaked wood. Everything felt unusually still. Finally, Maggie sat down slowly and untied the faded blue ribbon around the letters. Her hands trembled slightly. The paper inside had yellowed deeply with age, delicate enough to tear if handled carelessly. Several envelopes were addressed simply to Miss Eleanor Whitmore, Rose Harbor Bakery, Ashford Cove. Maine, no return address. Only initials. J.M. Daniel pulled his chair closer. The old clock ticked steadily nearby. Tick, tick, tick. Maggie carefully unfolded the first letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting remained elegant and steady. My dearest Eleanor, the ocean is cruel tonight. The fog rolled in before sunset and swallowed the harbor whole. Strange how a place can disappear so completely while still existing right in front of you. Sometimes I think people can do the same thing. I passed the bakery this morning before dawn. Your lights were already on. I could smell cinnamon all the way from Harbor Street. I nearly came inside. Nearly. But Ashford Cove watches everything, doesn't it? One day I'll stop being afraid of this town. Maggie stopped reading. Silence settled heavily across the kitchen. Daniel stared at the letter quietly. That doesn't sound like a casual friendship, he murmured. No, Maggie whispered. Outside, wind swept leaves across the porch with soft scratching sounds. Maggie unfolded the second page carefully. You once told me recipes are really memories written down so they don't disappear. I think perhaps people are the same. If anything ever happens, if I fail to return, promise me you'll keep the recipe safe. The one with the hidden notes. You'll understand someday why it matters. Maggie's pulse quickened instantly. The recipe. Daniel leaned forward sharply. Hidden notes? Maggie slowly reached for Eleanor's apple pie recipe lying beside the letters. The margins suddenly felt far more significant now. Almost coded. Almost deliberate. Daniel rubbed a hand across his jaw. This is getting stranger by the minute. Maggie unfolded another letter. This one was dated November 18th, 1948. Rain beat harder against the windows as she read aloud. Eleanor, I saw the lighthouse keeper again tonight. I believe he suspects something. He asked too many questions about Boston. Please be careful who sees us together, and whatever happens, do not trust promises made in November. Maggie froze. Daniel looked up instantly. That line was written in the recipe. Yes. A chill moved slowly through the kitchen. The exact same sentence. Not just random notes. Messages. Maggie continued reading. I still believe we should leave before winter comes. There's nothing left for me here except ghosts and old regrets. But you still belong to this town in ways I never will. Perhaps that's the real tragedy. Some people are born free, others are born rooted. The letter ended simply, "Forever yours." James Daniel sat back heavily. "James," he said quietly. "J.M." Maggie nodded slowly. Neither spoke for several moments. The wind howled softly around the old house. Then Daniel finally asked the question both of them were thinking. What happened to him? Maggie looked down at the remaining letters. There's more. The next envelope appeared damaged by water stains. Parts of the ink had blurred slightly over time. As Maggie unfolded it, something small slipped onto the table. A key. Tiny. Brass. Old-fashioned. Daniel picked it up carefully. "What is this?" Maggie shook her head slowly. Beneath where the key had been hidden, another message appeared written in hurried handwriting. "If the bakery ever closes, look beneath the floorboards behind the oven." Daniel's eyes widened. The bakery. Maggie suddenly remembered Clara mentioning the fire. Her grandmother's bakery had closed shortly afterward. Not because of business problems, not because Eleanor wanted it closed. Something happened there, something important. Thunder rolled heavily outside, the lights flickered. For one brief second, the kitchen dimmed almost completely before the warm glow returned. Maggie's heartbeat quickened again. She opened the final letter. Unlike the others, this one was shorter, more desperate. The handwriting trembled noticeably. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then things have gone badly. I pray you never learn the full truth of what happened at the harbor that night. Some secrets survive because they protect the people left behind. But if the child ever asks, tell them I tried to come back. J." Maggie stopped breathing for a moment. Daniel stared at her. "The child?" he whispered. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. Maggie slowly lowered the letter onto the table. Rain pounded harder against the windows now, while somewhere upstairs, the old house groaned softly beneath the storm. Neither of them spoke, because both were thinking the exact same terrifying possibility. What child? And why had Eleanor hidden all of this for nearly 70 years? Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, came the unmistakable sound of a door slowly creaking open upstairs. The storm finally passed sometime before dawn. When Maggie woke the next morning, Ashford Cove lay beneath a cold silver sky washed clean by rain. The fog had lifted from the harbor at last, revealing fishing boats rocking gently against their docks, while pale sunlight shimmered weakly across the Atlantic. But the warmth of morning never fully reached the Whitmore house. Not after the letters, not after the final line. If the child ever asks. Maggie had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, questions circled endlessly through her mind. Who was James? What happened at the harbor? And what child had Eleanor spent decades protecting? Downstairs, the old house carried its usual comforting smells. Coffee, cinnamon, old wood polished by time. Yet now even familiar rooms felt altered somehow, as though the past itself had quietly stepped back inside. Daniel sat at the kitchen table already dressed, flipping through the letters again beneath the morning light pouring softly through the windows. Beside him rested a notebook filled with names, dates, and observations, scribbled in sharp architectural handwriting. Maggie noticed immediately. You've made a timeline. Daniel looked up almost guiltily. I couldn't sleep. Neither could I, Maggie thought. Steam curled upward from her coffee mug while she sat across from him. Outside, gulls cried faintly over the harbor. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Daniel tapped one finger against the old photograph lying near the center of the table. We need to find out who he was. Maggie nodded slowly. And how do we do that? Daniel glanced toward the window thoughtfully. Small towns remember everything. A faint smile touched Maggie's lips. Yes, she whispered. They do. By late morning, they found themselves standing outside the Ashford Cove Public Library. The old brick building sat near the church at the edge of Main Street, wrapped in ivy gone deep crimson with autumn. Built in 1921, the library had always reminded Maggie of a forgotten place from another century. Tall windows, dusty shelves, polished wooden floors. The smell of paper and time. As they entered, warmth surrounded them instantly. The familiar scent nearly stopped Maggie in her tracks. Old books, leather bindings, dust, and faint traces of fireplace smoke from the reading room hearth crackling quietly nearby. Mrs. Evelyn Parker looked up from the front desk and smiled warmly over her glasses. Well, she said softly, if it isn't Margaret Whitmore. Evelyn had worked at the library for nearly 40 years. Thin and graceful despite her age, she moved through the building almost silently, as though she belonged among the books themselves. I heard about your mother, Evelyn said gently. She was a lovely woman. Thank you. Evelyn's eyes shifted toward Daniel. And Daniel Whitmore. My goodness. She smiled. Last time I saw you, you were hiding comic books inside history encyclopedias. Daniel laughed quietly. I had priorities. Yes, Evelyn said dryly. Poor ones. For a brief moment, warmth returned between them all. Then Maggie carefully removed the photograph from her purse. Evelyn's smile faded instantly. Not dramatically, but enough. You recognize him, Maggie said softly. The librarian hesitated. Outside, wind brushed dead leaves across the library steps. Finally, Evelyn exhaled slowly. I wondered if those photographs would ever surface again. Daniel leaned forward. Who is he? Evelyn glanced toward the nearly empty reading room before lowering her voice. James Monroe. The name seemed to settle heavily into the silence. James Monroe. At last, the initials had become a person. Maggie felt her pulse quicken. Who was he? She asked quietly. Evelyn folded her hands carefully. He arrived in Ashford Cove in the autumn of 1947. Said he was from Boston. Quiet man, educated. She paused. Far too educated for this town, people used to say. Daniel exchanged a glance with Maggie. What did he do here? He asked. Worked at the harbor office for a while. Helped the lighthouse keeper during storms. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. Mostly he spent time at the bakery. Eleanor. Maggie looked again at the photograph. Now the man's face seemed different somehow. Not mysterious anymore. Human. Real. What happened to him? She whispered. Evelyn's eyes drifted toward the rain-gray windows. That depends on which story you believe. Daniel frowned slightly. There's more than one? In small towns, Evelyn said quietly. There always is. The old fireplace crackled softly nearby. A few pages rustled somewhere deeper in the library. Then Evelyn stood slowly. Come with me. She led them through narrow aisles lined with dusty local archives toward a small room near the back labeled Ashford Historical Records. Inside, the air smelled strongly of old newspapers and aging paper. Metal cabinets lined the walls, boxes stacked high near the corners. Entire decades preserved in silence. Evelyn carefully opened one drawer and removed a bound collection of newspapers from 1948. The brittle pages crackled softly beneath her fingers. She turned carefully until stopping at one article near the center. Daniel leaned closer. The headline read, Local harbor accident claims 2 fishermen during November's storm. Maggie scanned the article quickly. No mention of James, no mention of Eleanor, no mention of the bakery. But then Evelyn pointed toward a tiny notice near the bottom corner. Look! Maggie adjusted her glasses. The announcement was small enough most readers would have missed it entirely. Rose Harbor Bakery closed temporarily following structural fire damage. Her breath caught. Same week, same storm. Daniel narrowed his eyes. That can't be coincidence. No, Evelyn whispered softly. It wasn't. Maggie looked up. What really happened? The older woman hesitated for a long moment, then quietly said, Some people believe James disappeared during the harbor storm. She paused. Others believed he left town deliberately. And Eleanor? Evelyn's expression grew sad. She never spoke his name again. Silence settled heavily over the archive room. Dust drifted lazily through pale light from the tiny windows overhead. Then Daniel noticed something tucked inside the newspaper pages. A photograph clipping, smaller than the one from the attic. More faded. He carefully lifted it free. It showed Rose Harbor Bakery before the fire. The front windows glowed warmly beneath falling snow, while townspeople stood outside smiling. But in the far corner of the picture, barely visible through the window, stood Eleanor, and beside her, James. One hand rested gently against Eleanor's stomach. Maggie stopped breathing. Daniel looked at her slowly. The child. Outside the library windows, church bells began ringing softly across Ashford Cove as somewhere far beyond the harbor. Dark storm clouds gathered once again. By evening, the sky above Ashford Cove had turned the color of faded charcoal. The ocean wind carried the sharp scent of incoming rain through town, while fog drifted once more across the harbor, swallowing the distant lighthouse in pale gray mist. Maggie could not stop thinking about the photograph. James's hand resting gently against Eleanor's stomach. The hidden letters. The child. Every piece of the mystery now seemed connected to the bakery. Rose Harbor Bakery. The place her grandmother had loved more than anything. The place no one spoke about anymore. Daniel drove slowly through the narrow streets while windshield wipers brushed rhythmically against the glass. Warm yellow lights glowed behind curtains throughout town as families settled inside for dinner, safe from the growing storm outside. Ashford Cove looked beautiful at night in late autumn. Lonely, but beautiful. The bakery stood near the far edge of Harbor Street, close to the water, where old fishing warehouses and weathered docks lined the shoreline. As they approached, Maggie's chest tightened. The building looked smaller than she remembered, and sadder. Time had not been gentle with it. The faded sign reading Rose Harbor Bakery still hung crookedly above the entrance, its gold lettering nearly erased by decades of salt air and winter storms. Several windows were boarded shut, while others remained cracked beneath layers of dust and grime. Wild ivy climbed the brick walls like veins. The place looked abandoned, forgotten. Yet even now, beneath the smell of rain and ocean wind, Maggie imagined she could still smell bread. Daniel parked quietly across the street. For a moment, neither moved. Rain tapped softly against the roof of the car. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. Maggie stared at the bakery through the fogged windshield. "No," she admitted softly. Then she opened the door. Cold wind hit them immediately. Their shoes splashed through puddles as they crossed the empty street beneath flickering streetlights. Somewhere nearby, a loose metal sign banged rhythmically in the wind. The closer Maggie came to the bakery, the stranger she felt. Not fear exactly, recognition, as though the building remembered her. The front door resisted at first when Daniel pushed it, then suddenly groaned inward with a long, aching creak. A wave of cold, dusty air spilled out. The darkness inside felt enormous. Daniel switched on his phone flashlight. Soft beams of light swept slowly across the abandoned bakery. Dust floated heavily through the air. Old tables stood overturned near the walls. Rusted baking trays remained stacked beside ancient ovens coated in ash and flour, hardened by time. Cobwebs stretched across corners while cracked tiles disappeared beneath decades of dirt. Yet beneath all the decay, the bakery still carried traces of warmth, of memory. Maggie stepped slowly inside. Her footsteps echoed softly through the silence. "I remember this place," she whispered. Daniel glanced toward her. "You do?" "Just pieces." She moved farther into the room carefully, touching the edge of an old wooden counter. "When I was little, Eleanor used to give me cinnamon rolls before dinner." A faint smile crossed her face. "Mom always complained it spoiled my appetite." Her voice echoed gently through the darkness. The storm outside intensified. Rain hammered the boarded windows while wind whistled softly through cracks in the walls. Daniel swept the flashlight across the far side of the bakery. "There," he said quietly. Near the back stood the massive old brick oven. Even in darkness, it dominated the room like some sleeping giant from another century. Maggie's pulse quickened immediately. "The letters." "Look beneath the floorboards behind the oven." They moved carefully toward it. The closer they came, the colder the bakery seemed to grow. Water dripped steadily somewhere overhead. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in Daniel's hand. Behind the oven stood a narrow storage corridor almost hidden in shadows. Maggie frowned. "I don't remember this." Daniel pushed aside a broken shelving unit blocking part of the hallway. Dust exploded into the air. Then the beam of light landed on something strange. Fresh scratches on the wooden floorboards. Recent, not decades old. Daniel noticed them too. "You said nobody's been here in years?" Maggie nodded slowly. A strange unease tightened in her stomach. The hallway led to a small hidden room tucked behind the oven walls. Its door stood slightly open. Cold air drifted out from the darkness beyond. Rain thundered against the roof overhead. Daniel looked toward Maggie. "You stay here." She immediately shook her head. "No." Slowly, carefully, they pushed the door wider. The flashlight beam swept across the hidden room, and both of them froze. The room had been untouched for decades. Old furniture remained covered in dust sheets. Shelves lined the walls filled with jars, papers, records, and boxes. A record player sat near the corner beside stacks of vinyl albums. But that wasn't what stopped Maggie's breath. It was the lamp. A small oil lamp sitting near the desk. Still warm. Someone had been here recently. Then Daniel's flashlight shifted slightly lower and illuminated a fresh set of muddy footprints leading deeper into the hidden room, just as the storm outside knocked the power out across the entire block. Darkness swallowed everything instantly, and somewhere inside the bakery, something moved. Darkness swallowed the bakery whole. For one breathless moment, Maggie could hear nothing except the violent rain crashing against the roof and the pounding of her own heartbeat echoing inside her chest. Then, somewhere deeper inside the hidden room, came the soft scrape of movement. Daniel immediately stepped in front of her. "Maggie," he whispered sharply, "don't move." The flashlight beam from his phone flickered weakly once before stabilizing again, casting narrow, trembling light across the dust-covered walls. The hidden room seemed even smaller now in darkness. More intimate, more secretive. The air smelled faintly of old paper, cedar wood, burnt sugar, and something metallic beneath decades of dust. Rainwater dripped steadily through pipes somewhere inside the walls, while wind moaned softly through cracks in the old building. Daniel slowly swept the flashlight across the room again. The muddy footprints continued toward the far corner, then disappeared, as though whoever had stood there simply vanished. Maggie wrapped her arms tightly around herself against the cold. "Did you see anyone?" she whispered. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," but his voice carried uncertainty. The room itself felt wrong somehow. Not abandoned, occupied, as though someone had only just left moments before they arrived. The weak beam of light moved carefully across shelves lined with old glass jars filled with recipe cards, dried flowers, and yellowed papers tied neatly with ribbon. A faded floral armchair sat beside a small record player near the wall, and above it hung several framed photographs coated in dust. Maggie stepped closer carefully. Her breath caught instantly. The photographs showed Eleanor, smiling, laughing, alive in ways Maggie had never known her. One picture showed Eleanor standing outside the bakery during winter beside James Monroe. Snow covered the sidewalks around them while James held 2 cups of coffee in gloved hands. In another photograph, Eleanor sat near the harbor wearing a pale wool coat, while James looked at her with unmistakable tenderness. Not scandal, not secrecy. Love. Real love. The kind that quietly reshapes an entire life. Maggie stared at the images, stunned by how young Eleanor looked. Not simply younger in age, younger in spirit. Hopeful. Daniel stepped beside her silently. "She looked happy," he murmured. Yes, Maggie whispered softly. She did. The realization hurt more than she expected, because Maggie suddenly understood something deeply painful. She had never truly known her grandmother at all. Not the woman before grief, before silence, before whatever happened in 1948. Outside, thunder shook the old bakery walls. The flashlight beam shifted toward a desk near the corner. Unlike everything else in the room, the surface had recently been disturbed. Dust patterns had been smeared aside, as though someone had searched through the papers not long ago. Daniel noticed it too. "Someone's been coming here," he said quietly. Maggie nodded. But who? And why now? Daniel carefully opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside rested dozens of neatly stacked journals, leather-bound, worn with age, each labeled carefully by year. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the final one. Eleanor's journal. The leather cover felt soft and fragile beneath her fingers. Dust drifted through the flashlight beam as she opened it carefully. The handwriting inside matched the recipe cards immediately. Elegant, measured, beautiful. The first entries described ordinary things: bakery orders, town gossip, weather near the harbor. But then the tone changed. Maggie turned slowly through the pages while Daniel stood beside her reading silently. October 2nd, 1947. Today a man came into the bakery just before closing. Boston accent, dark coat still wet from rain. Ordered coffee and apple bread. Stayed nearly 2 hours pretending to read while watching the harbor through the window. I believe he carries sadness the way some people carry winter inside them. Maggie swallowed hard. She turned another page. November 14th, 1947. James says he cannot stay in Ashford Cove forever. This town asks too many questions, but when he looks at me, I almost believe people can begin again no matter what came before. The storm outside intensified again. Rain hammered against the roof while wind rattled the bakery windows violently. Maggie kept reading. December 3rd, 1947. I should not love him. Not because of town gossip, not because of family expectations, but because every time I do, I become someone brave enough to leave. Maggie stopped reading for a moment. The room felt unbearably quiet. Daniel stared toward the floor thoughtfully. She wanted to leave town with him. Yes, but she didn't. Maggie looked down at the journal again. No. Her voice carried sadness now, because somewhere between these pages and the woman Maggie remembered, something had broken. She turned farther ahead, then froze. An entry dated November 22nd, 1948. The handwriting trembled noticeably. Ink smeared in places as though written through tears. The storm has swallowed the harbor tonight. James never returned. People keep asking questions I cannot answer. If this town learns the truth, everything will be destroyed. For the child's sake, I must bury what remains of us. Maggie's breath caught sharply. Daniel looked at her. The child was real. She nodded slowly. Cold fear moved through her chest now. But the next page terrified her even more, because tucked carefully inside the journal was a birth certificate. Maggie pulled it free with trembling hands. The paper had yellowed deeply with age. Name of mother, Eleanor Rose Whitmore. Name of father, James Monroe. Name of child, blank. No name, no official registration, no recorded birth. Daniel stared at the document in disbelief. What does that even mean? Maggie shook her head slowly. It means someone erased this child. Lightning flashed violently outside. For one blinding second, the hidden room illuminated completely. And, in that brief flash, Maggie noticed something carved into the wooden wall near the back shelf. 3 initials. JMW. Daniel saw them too. Silence filled the room. Then very slowly, he whispered, "Whitmore." Maggie looked at him. Neither spoke, because both had just realized the same impossible thing. James Monroe may never have disappeared from the family at all. The storm finally broke sometime after midnight. By morning, Ashford Cove rested beneath a strange stillness that always followed coastal storms. Fog drifted low across the harbor while puddles shimmered silver beneath pale November sunlight. Fallen leaves clung to sidewalks and porch steps, darkened by rain and crushed beneath passing tires. But inside Maggie's house, calm never came. The birth certificate lay on the kitchen table beside Eleanor's journal. Neither Maggie nor Daniel had touched it since returning from the bakery. The unnamed child haunted the room like a ghost. Maggie stood near the stove stirring oatmeal she had no intention of eating, while Daniel sat silently by the window, staring toward the fog-covered harbor beyond town. Neither had slept much. The old house seemed restless, too. Floorboards creaked in empty hallways. Pipes sighed softly inside walls. The grandfather clock ticked louder than usual, as if time itself had become impatient. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. What if James didn't disappear? Maggie looked toward him slowly. You think he stayed? Daniel rubbed tired eyes. I think somebody wanted everyone to believe he disappeared. The idea settled heavily into the room. Maggie poured tea into 2 cups while her thoughts spiraled endlessly through everything they had discovered. The hidden room, the journals, the photographs, the child, and now the carved initials. JMW, James Monroe Whitmore. Not Monroe, Whitmore. A family name. Their family name. Daniel stood and began pacing slowly across the kitchen. You said nobody ever talked about Eleanor having another child. They didn't. Then where did the child go? Maggie shook her head helplessly. I don't know. But deep inside, a terrible possibility had already begun forming. What if someone in town knew? What if multiple people knew, and had spent 70 years pretending otherwise? A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Both froze instantly. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. Daniel crossed the hallway first. Cold air rushed inside when he opened the door. Clara Bennett stood on the porch wrapped in a thick navy coat, clutching a covered casserole dish against the cold. But one look at their faces made her expression change immediately. You found something. It wasn't a question. Inside the kitchen, Clara removed her gloves slowly while Maggie placed the birth certificate on the table. The older woman stared at it for several long seconds, then quietly sat down. Oh, Eleanor. Maggie's pulse quickened. You knew. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Not everything, but enough. Rainwater dripped softly from Clara's coat onto the wooden floor. Outside, the wind carried distant church bells across town. Finally, Clara spoke. There were rumors after the storm in 1948, she admitted softly. People whispered Eleanor had gone away for several months. Maggie stared at her. Gone where? No one knew. Daniel folded his arms. And when she came back? Clara's expression tightened painfully. She wasn't the same. Silence filled the kitchen. Maggie suddenly remembered fragments from childhood. Eleanor sitting quietly by windows, watching the harbor, pausing whenever storms rolled in from the Atlantic, always waiting for something, or someone. She had a child, Maggie whispered. Clara nodded slowly. Yes. The room seemed to tilt around Maggie. Daniel leaned forward sharply. What happened to the baby? Clara hesitated, then whispered, The baby survived. Maggie gripped the edge of the table. Survived. Not died, not disappeared. Survived. Her voice barely emerged. Where is the child now? Clara looked toward the fogged kitchen windows, and for the first time since this began, she seemed genuinely frightened. I think, she whispered slowly, you already know them. Silence crashed over the kitchen. Daniel frowned immediately. What does that mean? Clara looked at Maggie, not Daniel. Maggie. And suddenly something cold moved through Maggie's entire body. A memory. Small. Forgotten. Buried. She remembered being 7 years old, standing in this very kitchen while her mother argued quietly with Eleanor late at night. You can't keep pretending forever, Helen had whispered angrily, and Eleanor had answered, she must never know. At the time, Maggie thought they were discussing money, or illness, or some ordinary adult problem. But now, her breathing quickened. No, she whispered softly. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Maggie. Daniel looked between them both in confusion. What? Maggie stared down at the birth certificate, then at Eleanor's journal, then finally at Clara. And suddenly the truth became unbearable. She wasn't my grandmother, Maggie whispered. The room fell silent. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Clara reached carefully across the table and took Maggie's trembling hand. She raised you after Helen, Clara said softly. But Eleanor, her voice broke slightly. Eleanor was your mother. Daniel stared in disbelief. What? Maggie's chest tightened painfully. No, she whispered again, tears filling her eyes now. No, that's impossible. But even as she denied it, pieces of memory shifted violently into place. Her mother, Helen, had always felt more like an older sister. The strange age difference, the whispers, the way Eleanor held her whenever storms frightened her as a child, the way townspeople sometimes looked at them, not grandmother and granddaughter, mother and daughter. Daniel stepped backward slowly, stunned. Maggie. She covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Her entire life suddenly felt fragile, rewritten. Every memory now carried another meaning beneath it. Eleanor had not hidden someone else's child. She had hidden her own. and Maggie Whitmore had spent 63 years living inside a secret no one dared speak aloud. Outside, the harbor fog thickened once more around Ashford Cove. And somewhere far across town, inside the abandoned bakery, a single hidden light flickered on behind the boarded windows. Snow arrived early that year. Not a heavy storm, not yet, but a quiet, drifting snowfall that began sometime during the night and settled gently across Ashford Cove by morning. The harbor docks wore thin white blankets of frost. Rooftops shimmered pale beneath the weak winter sun, and the old lighthouse stood like a lonely shadow against the gray Atlantic sky. The town looked softer beneath snow, kinder somehow, as if winter covered old wounds the way blankets cover sleeping children. But Maggie felt no comfort as she stood at the kitchen window watching snowflakes swirl through the cold morning air. The truth Clara revealed yesterday still echoed painfully inside her mind. Eleanor was not her grandmother. Eleanor was her mother. Even thinking the words made her chest tighten. Her entire life had shifted beneath her feet. Nothing felt solid anymore. Not memories, not family, not herself. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon toast and coffee, but Maggie hadn't touched either. Her tea sat untouched beside the sink while snow gathered quietly along the porch railing outside. Behind her, Daniel pulled on his coat. "We should go," he said softly. Maggie nodded slowly. Clara had called early that morning with another name, Walter Grayson, 91 years old, former harbor mechanic, last surviving person believed to know what truly happened during the storm of 1948. The last witness, Clara called him. According to her, Walter rarely spoke to anyone anymore. He lived alone near the edge of town in a weathered cottage overlooking the cliffs beyond the lighthouse, and for 70 years, he had kept silent. The drive north along the coastal road felt strangely dreamlike. Snow drifted softly across the windshield while ocean waves crashed far below the cliffs in slow white bursts against dark rocks. Bare trees bent beneath the wind, their branches rattling like old bones against the winter sky. Daniel drove quietly. Maggie stared out the window. The farther they traveled from town, the more isolated the world became. By the time Walter's cottage appeared through the snowfall, it looked almost swallowed by the landscape itself. Small, gray, weathered by decades of ocean storms. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. A porch light glowed weakly beside the front door. Daniel killed the engine. "You okay?" he asked gently. Maggie looked toward the cottage. "No," she admitted, but she stepped out into the cold anyway. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots as they approached the porch. Wind swept across the cliffs, carrying the sharp scent of salt water and pine through the freezing air. Maggie knocked carefully. For several moments, nothing happened. Then came the slow sound of footsteps inside. The door opened only slightly at first. An old man peered out beneath thick gray eyebrows. Walter Grayson looked exactly like someone shaped by the sea and hard winters. His face carried deep lines carved by time, grief, and decades of harbor winds. One shoulder leaned slightly lower than the other, and his hands trembled faintly against the doorframe, but his eyes remained sharp, very sharp. He studied Maggie for only 2 seconds before something in his expression changed. Recognition. "My God," he whispered. Maggie's breath caught. Walter stared at her like he'd seen a ghost. "You look exactly like her." The cottage smelled of firewood, old books, tobacco, and coffee brewed too strong. Inside, a stone fireplace crackled warmly while snow tapped softly against the windows. The small living room overflowed with decades of accumulated life. Fishing maps, photographs, tools, old records, weather journals. A clock ticked softly near the mantel. Walter lowered himself carefully into a worn leather chair, while Maggie and Daniel sat opposite him near the fire. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Walter looked directly at Maggie. "Eleanor never wanted you to know." The words landed heavily in the room. Maggie folded trembling hands together. "Why?" Walter stared into the fire. "Because Ashford Cove wasn't kind to women back then." His voice sounded rough with age, especially women who loved the wrong people. Outside, wind rattled the windows softly. Daniel leaned forward. "What happened in 1948? Walter closed his eyes briefly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried 70 years of memory. "James Monroe came here after the war. Smart young man. Too smart for a town like this." A faint smile touched Walter's face. But Eleanor loved him anyway. Maggie listened silently as flames danced across the fireplace stones. "He planned to take Eleanor away before winter," Walter continued. "Boston, maybe farther south eventually." He paused, but then she found out she was pregnant. The room felt very still. Walter's gaze drifted toward Maggie again. "With you." Maggie's throat tightened painfully. Outside, snow continued falling across the cliffs. "Eleanor was terrified," Walter whispered. "Not because of the child, never because of you." His eyes softened. "She was afraid this town would destroy James." Daniel frowned slightly. "Destroy him how?" Walter sighed heavily. "James wasn't exactly who he claimed to be." Silence settled. The fire crackled softly. "What do you mean?" Maggie asked. Walter hesitated, then quietly said, "James Monroe was already married." The words struck the room like cold wind. Maggie stared at him in disbelief. "No." Walter nodded sadly. "Back in Boston, a wealthy family, powerful people." He shook his head slowly. "James fell in love with Eleanor anyway." Daniel rubbed a hand across his face. "So the town found out?" "Not at first," Walter said. "But secrets never stay buried in places like Ashford Cove." Snow swirled violently outside now. The old cottage groaned softly beneath the wind. Walter's voice grew quieter. "The night of the harbor storm, James tried to leave town." He swallowed hard. "But there was an accident near the docks." Maggie's pulse quickened. "What kind of accident?" Walter looked into the flames for a very long time before answering. "A fight." Daniel stiffened slightly. "Between who?" Walter exhaled slowly. "James and your grandfather." Silence. Complete silence. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Maggie's entire body went cold. Walter's eyes filled with regret. "Your grandfather loved Eleanor like his own daughter," he whispered. "When he learned about the pregnancy, and James's marriage. He shook his head. Everything shattered. Maggie could barely breathe. What happened to James? Walter looked toward the storm-dark windows. No one ever found a body. The words echoed through the cottage. Not dead. Missing. Lost to the storm. Or running from it. Nobody knew. And perhaps nobody ever would. Then Walter reached slowly toward the table beside him. From an old wooden drawer, he removed a small silver pocket watch, worn smooth with age. Inside the lid, engraved initials shimmered softly in the firelight. J.M. Walter handed it carefully to Maggie. He left this for Eleanor the night he disappeared. Maggie opened the watch slowly, and hidden inside was a tiny folded photograph of a newborn baby wrapped in a white blanket. On the back, written in faded ink, "For Margaret, so she'll always know she was loved." Tears blurred Maggie's vision instantly, because for the first time in 63 years, she finally knew who her father was. That night, the snow deepened across Ashford Cove. Streetlights glowed softly beneath falling flakes while the harbor disappeared once again into pale winter fog. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout town, and warm golden light flickered behind frosted windows where families gathered safely inside from the cold. But inside the Whitmore house, sleep still refused to come. The old home creaked gently beneath the weight of winter settling across its roof. Pipes hummed softly inside the walls while the grandfather clock continued its endless patient ticking in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Maggie sat alone in the living room wrapped in a knitted blanket Eleanor had made decades earlier. Her mother. Even now, the word felt unfamiliar. The fireplace crackled quietly nearby, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning cedar wood. Shadows danced softly across family photographs lining the mantel. Photographs that suddenly meant something entirely different now. Maggie held James's pocket watch carefully in her lap. She had opened it at least 20 times since leaving Walter's cottage. Every single time, her heart broke all over again at the tiny photograph hidden inside. For Margaret, so she'll always know she was loved. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Maggie stared into the flames while memories rose slowly through her mind like ghosts emerging from fog. Eleanor brushing her hair before school. Eleanor sitting beside her bed during thunderstorms. Eleanor teaching her how to bake pie crusts in this very kitchen. Not grandmotherly affection, motherly love. The realization carried both comfort and grief. How lonely Eleanor must have been. How frightened. To raise her own daughter while pretending to be something else. Maggie suddenly understood why Eleanor had spent so many years staring silently toward the harbor. She hadn't simply lost a man. She had buried an entire life. Footsteps creaked softly on the staircase behind her. Daniel appeared in the doorway wearing sweatpants and the old gray sweater she'd knitted years ago. His hair looked slightly messy from sleep, though Maggie suspected he hadn't slept much either. He paused when he saw her awake. Couldn't sleep. Maggie gave a faint, tired smile. Apparently, insomnia runs in the family. Daniel walked quietly into the room and lowered himself onto the sofa across from her. For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. Snow drifted endlessly outside. Finally, Daniel looked toward the pocket watch in her hands. You okay? The question sounded simple, but Maggie heard everything beneath it. Are you angry? Broken? Lost? Still yourself? She stared down at the watch. I don't know who I am tonight. Her voice cracked slightly on the final word. Daniel leaned forward slowly. You're still my mother. The sentence hit her harder than expected. Tears instantly filled her eyes. Maggie looked away quickly toward the fire. When I was little, she whispered softly, I used to wonder why I always felt different from everyone else. Daniel stayed quiet. Maggie continued, Not unhappy. She shook her head slowly. Just misplaced somehow. Her fingers tightened around the watch, like there was something everyone else understood about my life except me. The old house creaked softly around them. I spent 63 years believing Eleanor was my grandmother, she said quietly. And now every memory feels rewritten. Daniel studied the flames thoughtfully. Maybe not rewritten. Maggie looked at him. Then what? He hesitated. Maybe explained. The room fell silent again. Snow continued falling heavily beyond the windows. Maggie suddenly laughed softly through tears. You know what's strange? What? I'm not angry at her. Daniel nodded slowly. I don't think she gave you much choice. No. Maggie looked down at the watch. But I understand why she did it. She could imagine Ashford Cove in 1948 clearly now. The whispers, the judgment, the gossip spreading through church pews and grocery stores. An unmarried woman with a child. A married outsider from Boston. A scandal powerful enough to destroy reputations permanently in a town like this. Eleanor chose survival and love. Daniel leaned back against the sofa cushions, rubbing tired eyes. Walter said Grandpa fought James. Maggie nodded slowly. He thought he was protecting Eleanor. Do you think James survived? The question lingered heavily between them. Maggie stared into the fire. I don't know. But somewhere deep inside, she believed he had tried to come back. The letters proved that much. Silence returned once more. Then Daniel suddenly spoke again, quieter this time. I almost didn't come here. Maggie looked toward him. What? For the funeral. He stared at the floor now. I booked the flight 3 separate times before actually getting on the plane. Pain flickered across his face. Real pain. Not the guarded distance he usually hid behind. Maggie waited quietly. Daniel swallowed hard. After the divorce, he exhaled shakily. I didn't really know how to face anyone anymore. The honesty in his voice startled her. Daniel rarely spoke openly about emotions. Even as a teenager, he preferred silence over vulnerability. But tonight, something inside him seemed exhausted from carrying loneliness alone. I kept thinking, he continued quietly, if I stayed in Boston long enough, eventually I'd stop feeling like a failure. Maggie's chest tightened. Oh, Daniel. He shook his head quickly. No, it's stupid. It isn't. The firelight flickered gently across his face. I built this whole life, he whispered. Career, apartment, marriage. He laughed softly without humor. And somehow I still ended up completely alone. Maggie crossed the room slowly and sat beside him. For a moment neither moved. Then she rested one hand gently over his. Warm, steady, motherly. Exactly the way Eleanor once comforted her. "You are not alone," she said softly. Daniel stared into the fire, eyes glistening now. "I think I forgot what home felt like." Maggie squeezed his hand gently. Outside, snow buried the town deeper beneath silence. The old house glowed warmly around them, while the fireplace crackled beside generations of family photographs. For the first time in years, the distance between mother and son finally began to disappear. Then suddenly, a sharp sound echoed from the kitchen. Both froze instantly. A drawer sliding open, slowly, by itself. Daniel stood immediately. The firelight flickered violently as cold air drifted suddenly through the hallway. And somewhere deep inside the old house, music began playing softly. A piano. One single haunting melody Eleanor Whitmore used to play during winter storms. Morning arrived quietly over Ashford Cove. Fresh snow blanketed the town during the night, softening rooftops, fences, and harbor docks beneath a pale layer of white that glowed gently beneath the weak November sun. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys while church bells drifted faintly through the cold morning air. The storm had passed, but something inside Maggie had changed with it. For the first time since returning home, she woke not with grief pressing against her chest, but with purpose. The old Whitmore house felt warmer somehow as sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows, catching dust motes floating lazily above the table where Eleanor's journals still rested beside the faded recipe box. Outside, the world looked still. Inside, life had begun moving again. Daniel stood near the stove flipping pancakes while old jazz music played softly from the record player in the living room. The smell of coffee, maple syrup, and cinnamon filled the house with a warmth Maggie hadn't felt in years. For a moment, she simply stood in the doorway watching him. Her son. Laughing quietly at himself after nearly burning one pancake. The sight alone nearly brought tears to her eyes. Boston had stolen this softness from him for so long. Or perhaps loneliness had. Daniel glanced over his shoulder and caught her smiling. "What? You cook now?" He shrugged slightly. "Divorce teaches survival skills." Maggie laughed softly. The sound surprised both of them. Real laughter had become rare in this house after Eleanor died. But now, something old and broken inside the walls seemed to be healing. Daniel slid a plate toward her. "You know," he said carefully, "I kept thinking about the bakery last night." Maggie sat slowly. "So did I." Outside the kitchen window, snowflakes drifted lightly from the maple trees. Daniel hesitated briefly before speaking again. "We should reopen it." Maggie looked up sharply. "The bakery?" He nodded. "At least try." Silence settled between them while the old record crackled softly nearby. Maggie stared down at her coffee. Rose Harbor Bakery. For decades, the building had stood frozen in grief, slowly collapsing beside the harbor while the town quietly forgot what it once meant. But Eleanor had never truly abandoned it. She had hidden her life there, her love, her memories, her truth. And somehow, the bakery had waited for this moment. for her. By afternoon, they stood once again outside the old brick building near Harbor Street. But this time, it looked different to Maggie. Not haunted, hopeful. The faded sign still hung crooked above the entrance, snow gathered along the window sills, and ivy curled dark against the bricks. Yet beneath the decay, she could finally see what Eleanor once saw: warmth, possibility, home. Daniel unlocked the front door while cold harbor winds swept through the empty street. Inside, dust coated nearly every surface, but sunlight now streamed through cracks in the boarded windows, illuminating floating particles like tiny stars suspended in the air. The bakery no longer felt frightening, only forgotten. Clara arrived 20 minutes later carrying paint samples, cleaning supplies, and enough enthusiasm to fill the entire building herself. "Oh, this place still has good bones," she announced dramatically while brushing dust off an old counter. "Terrible wallpaper choices, but good bones." Daniel laughed quietly. For the next several days, the bakery slowly came alive again. Ashford Cove noticed immediately. Small towns always notice hope, especially after long winters. By Monday morning, several locals had already stopped by to offer help. Mr. Delaney repaired broken shelves. Teenagers from the church helped carry debris outside. Mrs. Porter brought homemade soup every afternoon, whether anyone asked for it or not. And every night, long after the harbor disappeared beneath fog and snow, the bakery glowed warmly once more. Maggie spent hours restoring Eleanor's kitchen. She polished old copper mixing bowls until they gleamed beneath the lights. She uncovered recipe cards tucked inside forgotten drawers. She even found Eleanor's favorite apron folded carefully beneath the counter, as though waiting all these years to be worn again. The first time Maggie tied it around her waist, she cried quietly in the empty kitchen. Not from sadness, from closeness. For the first time in her life, she no longer felt separated from Eleanor by silence. Now she understood her. Every hidden letter, every glance toward the harbor, every pie baked with trembling hope. Daniel restored the front windows himself. One snowy evening, Maggie stood outside watching him work beneath strings of temporary lights glowing softly against the falling snow. "You miss this place?" she said quietly. Daniel kept painting. "I didn't know I did." She smiled softly. "Yes, that was the strange thing about home. Sometimes people only understood its value after nearly losing it forever." As Thanksgiving approached, the bakery transformed completely. Fresh paint covered the walls. Warm yellow lights glowed in the windows. The scent of bread drifted once more across Harbor Street. And every evening Maggie baked Eleanor's apple pie recipe. Not because of the mystery anymore, because it felt like conversation, mother to daughter, past to present. One snowy night, while organizing old recipe books near the hidden room, Maggie discovered a final note tucked inside Eleanor's journal. Short, simple, written shakily near the end of Eleanor's life. "If Margaret ever learns the truth, tell her I never regretted choosing her. Not once." Maggie pressed trembling fingers against the page while tears blurred the ink. Outside, snow fell quietly across Ashford Cove. And somewhere deep inside, Rose Harbor Bakery. The past finally began to rest, Thanksgiving arrived wrapped in snow and golden light. Ashford Cove looked like something from an old Christmas postcard by the final week of November. Snow lined the harbor docks in soft white drifts, while evergreen wreaths decorated storefronts along Main Street. Warm lights glowed from cafe windows, and nearly every chimney in town sent thin trails of smoke curling into the pale winter sky. But nowhere felt warmer than Rose Harbor Bakery. The bakery had officially reopened 3 days before Thanksgiving. Not with fanfare, not with advertisements. Just the simple scent of fresh bread drifting once again through Harbor Street early in the morning. And somehow, that was enough. By sunrise each day, townspeople already gathered outside the windows, holding steaming coffee cups against the cold. Some came for pastries, others came for memories. Many simply wanted to see the lights on again. Inside, warmth wrapped around every corner. Cinnamon, vanilla, fresh bread, coffee, apples baking slowly in the ovens. The old building no longer felt abandoned. It breathed again. Maggie stood near the counter rolling pie dough while snow drifted softly outside the windows. Christmas music played quietly through an old radio near the kitchen shelves, and laughter filled the bakery in ways she had not heard since childhood. Clara sat nearby assembling pie boxes while pretending not to steal cookie dough every few minutes. "I'm quality testing," she insisted each time Daniel caught her. Daniel himself worked near the front windows, hanging greenery and small white lights across the shelves. Watching him move through the bakery still amazed Maggie. He looked lighter now, not entirely healed, but no longer carrying loneliness alone. That mattered. Outside, children ran through snow-covered sidewalks while church bells rang softly somewhere beyond the harbor fog. The entire town seemed gentler during Thanksgiving week, more forgiving. Maggie removed another apple pie from the oven carefully. The scent instantly filled the room. Warm butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg. The smell wrapped around her like memory itself. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, and suddenly she could almost feel Eleanor standing beside her. Not as ghost, not as mystery, as mother. The realization no longer hurt the way it once had. Now it felt strangely comforting. Love had survived even silence. "Maggie," she turned. Daniel stood near the doorway holding a cardboard box he had just discovered while cleaning the upstairs storage loft. "What's this?" Maggie frowned slightly. The box looked old, very old. Its corners had softened with age, and Eleanor's handwriting appeared faintly across the lid. "For Thanksgiving only." Carefully, Maggie opened it. Inside rested dozens of old Thanksgiving decorations, handmade napkins, candles, pressed leaf centerpieces, recipe cards, tiny handwritten menu notes, and beneath them all, a sealed envelope. Maggie's breath caught immediately. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. On the front, "To be opened when the family feels whole again." Silence filled the bakery. Even Clara stopped moving. Very carefully, Maggie unfolded the letter. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then perhaps the bakery is alive again. Perhaps laughter has returned to these walls. Perhaps you finally know the truth. There were many years I feared you would hate me if you discovered who I really was. But motherhood is sometimes nothing more than loving someone enough to survive for them. You were never my shame. You were my miracle. And James, he loved you before he ever held you. Please remember that. Family is not built from perfect beginnings. It is built from forgiveness, warmth, and the people who stay when winter comes. Bake the pie every Thanksgiving. Open the windows before sunrise, and always leave the porch light on. Someone may still need help finding their way home. Love always, Mother. Tears streamed silently down Maggie's face by the time she finished. Clara wiped her own eyes openly. Even Daniel looked away toward the snowy windows for a moment. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Harbor Street, while warm light glowed from the bakery windows into the winter evening. And for the first time in 63 years, Maggie no longer felt lost. Thanksgiving Day dawned cold and bright over Ashford Cove. Fresh snow covered the town in soft white silence, while sunlight shimmered across the harbor like scattered silver. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. Church bells echoed through the crisp morning air, and the entire coastline seemed wrapped in peaceful stillness. Inside the Whitmore house, warmth lived in every room. The kitchen glowed golden beneath hanging lights, while the scent of roasting turkey, cinnamon, sage, butter, and fresh bread drifted through the old hallways. Christmas records played softly from the living room while snow tapped gently against the windows. The house no longer felt lonely. Not anymore. Maggie stood near the stove wearing Eleanor's faded apron, carefully brushing melted butter across pie crusts while Clara arranged candles down the center of the dining table. Daniel carried firewood inside from the porch, his cheeks red from cold and snow resting across his dark coat. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily nearby. But today the sound no longer felt sad. It felt comforting, like time itself had finally settled. The dining room looked beautiful. The old oak table stretched nearly the length of the room beneath warm candlelight and evergreen branches woven carefully through the centerpieces. Eleanor's china rested beside polished silverware while snow-covered maple branches framed the windows outside like scenes painted onto glass. Maggie paused for a moment, simply taking it all in. The warmth, the laughter, the voices, the life. For years after her husband died, Thanksgiving had become quieter each season, smaller, emptier. Eventually, she stopped setting extra plates entirely. But tonight, the house felt alive again. Neighbors arrived carrying casseroles and pies. Clara brought her famous cranberry cake. Walter Grayson even appeared briefly wrapped in a thick wool coat to deliver fresh harbor oysters before returning home before dark. And throughout the evening, stories filled the rooms. Stories about Eleanor, about the bakery, about old winters and lost summers and fishing boats and dances long forgotten. The past no longer felt painful tonight. It felt present, loved. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Ashford Cove, while inside the fireplace crackled warmly beneath generations of family photographs. At one point during dinner, Daniel stood quietly and tapped his glass gently. The room softened into silence. He looked nervous, truly nervous. Maggie watched him carefully. Daniel cleared his throat. I spent a long time thinking home was a place you eventually outgrow, he admitted quietly. But he glanced around the room slowly. I think maybe home is the place that waits for you anyway. The room grew still. Clara dabbed her eyes immediately. Daniel looked toward Maggie. And I think Grandma Eleanor understood that better than anyone. Maggie felt tears rise again instantly. Daniel lifted his glass slightly. To Eleanor Whitmore. Everyone echoed softly. To Eleanor. Outside, wind swept snow gently across the harbor. Later that evening, after dinner dishes had been washed and neighbors slowly drifted home through the snowy streets, Maggie found herself alone in the kitchen. The house hummed quietly around her. Soft music, fireplace crackling, Daniel laughing faintly somewhere upstairs while helping Clara untangle Christmas lights. Maggie stood beside the window holding Eleanor's recipe box. The same cedar box she had discovered in the attic only weeks earlier. The box that changed everything. Snowflakes drifted endlessly beyond the glass while the porch light glowed warmly against the winter darkness. Always leave the porch light on. Eleanor's words lingered gently in her mind. Maggie opened the box one final time. Inside rested the recipe cards, the letters, the photographs, the pocket watch, the hidden memories of an entire lifetime. She touched each item slowly, not with grief anymore, with understanding. At the very bottom of the box lay Eleanor's apple pie recipe, softened with age, stained with cinnamon and butter, beautifully imperfect. Maggie smiled through quiet tears, then carefully closed the lid. Outside, the snow continued falling softly across Ashford Cove, while warm golden light spilled from the old Whitmore house into the winter night. And somewhere beyond the harbor fog, the lighthouse still stood watching faithfully over those trying to find their way home. For the first time in many years, Margaret Whitmore finally felt she had found hers too.